Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's counterfactual is about what happened on one night, but also what has happened over the subsequent decades. I'm talking to regular PPF contributor Lea Ypi about the night in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. Could that day and night have gone differently? And if it had, what kind of a world would we be living in now? Lea, I know that you and I are going to have very different memories of the actual fall of the Berlin Wall. I have memories of it. You don't, presumably. So what age were you in November 1989?
I was 10.
When did you hear that it had happened? Not on the night, I'm guessing.
No, not at all. And I actually have no memory of when I heard it had happened because it was not the defining event of my childhood. The defining event of my childhood was the execution of Ceausescu, the murder of Ceausescu and his wife, which came later. And as far as the Berlin Wall is concerned, I always thought of West Germany and East Germany as equally alien to communist Albania. My country was distant from both. And for us, people who went to East Germany and came with jeans and chewing gum, they were just like people who they had gone to West Germany. And so in my mind back then, it's weird. Germany was reunified before it was actually reunified because from the Albanian perspective, these were equally distant realities.
So the wall itself didn't have the symbolic value for you that it did, not just in the West, I mean, in other places too, but particularly in Western Europe. The wall was the symbol of the division of Europe.
Absolutely, and of the collapse of communism in many ways. No, I think I remember better even then, sort of indirectly, but in Albania in the summer of 1990, so there was a year after, there was a whole movement that kind of paralleled what had been going on in Eastern Europe before, several months before, in terms of people attempting to cross via getting access to foreign embassies. And so the Albanians, exactly 1 year after the East Germans had tried to do the same, were trying to climb the walls and succeeded in climbing the walls of these Western embassies and asked for political asylum. And that also somehow set in motion a whole chain of events that eventually led to new legal reform and pluralism and a multi-party system in Albania. But this was really a long time after.
So I was quite a lot older than you. I was a student, and I do remember it very vividly. I think a lot of people who are adults in the West remember it, partly because the night itself. So we're talking about the 9th of November, 1989. It happened in the evening, European time. And the news spread immediately. This is obviously a pre-internet age, but it's a TV age, it's a radio age. And people were aware that night that something had happened and the drama was real. But weirdly, my presiding memory of that period was from a few weeks earlier. I've always remembered this. I was a student. I was thinking of doing a PhD. On German history, which was a bad idea because I couldn't speak German very well. Anyway, enough about me. But I went to see in Cambridge a very distinguished historian of Germany. He's no longer alive. And I went to his office and I knocked on the door and I walked in and he was listening to, I think it was the BBC World Service, but he was listening to English language coverage of what was happening in East Germany. So this was the time, as you say, where there was a lot of movement of people out of East Germany, some of it through Hungary, but a lot of it pressure on Western embassies, particularly in Czechoslovakia and Prague. The West German embassy was more or less under siege. There were peaceful protests in East Germany, and it was very clear that this regime was tottering. This is a few weeks before the wall came down. No one knew the wall was going to come down, but the clock was ticking on the East German regime. That's what it felt like. And this historian said to me, I'd never met him before, if history teaches us anything, it's this is going to be a bloodbath. He said, regimes like this just do not fold. They don't throw in the towel. It's not how it works. And he was sort of saying these BBC reporters are being far too sanguine about this, talking about it as though it was this sort of peaceful uprising. You know, I study German history, I study European history, and I know that there will be blood on the streets. And so I came out of his office a bit shaken, thinking, wow, this guy really knows. And of course, he was wrong. The regime did throw in the towel. And, the thing that he said history teaches us doesn't happen did happen. And he thought the people who run this country, both in East Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, they have too much at stake in this thing. Their hands are too dirty, basically, just to walk away. With hindsight, do you still have any sense of surprise around that this regime did throw in the towel?
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, because I had a conversation many years later after your conversation with someone who was also an expert of Germany, a Harvard professor, I can't remember in what context. And he said that a week before the Berlin Wall fell, he had been asked, professor, in class, do you think the Berlin Wall will fall? And he had said, not in my lifetime. And so, he gave this as an example of never listen to academics making predictions about real world events, because they have a lot of historical knowledge. But then if there's anything distinctive about politics, is that there is free will. And however much you can infer from previous events, you can't determine what course free will take, actually. So in that sense, I would say, yes, the actual event was maybe surprising. And in many ways, it is related to this famous episode of the press conference in which border changes were being announced, the changes to the rules concerning free travel for East German citizens to other countries had just been passed and were going to be implemented apparently the following day. And there was this German official who was there to inform the press about the new draft law concerning changes to freedom of movement, which came, as you said earlier, in part as a response to the pressure on these Western embassies around Europe, in particular Czechoslovakia, where East German citizens were trying to get access and demand asylum. And so the authorities in East Germany had been under pressure to make changes to the existing rules concerning travel for East German citizens to Western Europe, but in particular in that case to West Germany. So he's in this press conference. He's just been given a piece of paper with but he has not been briefed about it. He's just been handed a document with the new draft, and he's now suddenly being subjected to pressure by the media on what does this exactly mean and what does the draft law exactly say. And he's at this press conference, keeps looking at this paper. And then at some point, a journalist asks him, so there are these changes. The changes had to do mostly with the fact that East German citizens before had to go through a lengthy process of proving that they had links in West Germany. And now all of that was being liberalized. So all you had to do was to apply to get permission to exit East Germany. And so as he's announcing these rules concerning temporary travel, at some point someone says, so when does this come into effect? And then he gets there's increasing pressure. And he says, so does this have immediate effect? And he says, yes, it's with immediate effect. And then at one other point, he is asked, well, does this also involve Berlin crossings? Because the draft regulations concerned at the beginning the idea that there might be another opening, specifically designated border crossing. And so he's asked, does this involve Berlin? And he says, yes, anywhere. And of course, there's all the issue of that historians have been writing about, these border guards who are there, who keep asking authorities, what should we do? There's all these people amassing who have followed the press conference on East German television and then begin to flood to the crossings. And the authorities are basically being told to just let them go. And so this is how the night unfolds, I think, after this press conference, which was, if I remember correctly, 6 or 7 in the evening. You have these people who start going to cross at these borders. And then the night itself develops in ways that are more and more spontaneous, more and more unpredictable. And that's what begins, I think, the process of the destruction of the wall, which, as you say, then eventually becomes a symbol of the collapse of communism.
Exactly. And this is what makes it interesting for thinking about it counterfactually. So we're going to talk about what might have followed had the wall not fallen at that time. Could this regime have survived in another form and so on? But the night itself, there's a famous description of it by a historian of this period, Mary Sorotti, and she called the fall of the Berlin Wall, I quote, an accident, a semi-comical and bureaucratic mistake. That's the press conference that you're talking about. I think the guy was called Gunter Schabowski, and he clearly was all at sea. He was a senior communist official, but he didn't know what he'd been briefed to say. He was under real pressure from not the kind of press conference they were used to. Western media there really giving them a hard time, demanding answers. And there was something panicky about his response. And the regime, to that point, it had thought it was still managing this process. I think the understanding was that the people would be allowed to leave and their passports or documents would be stamped with a no return stamp on them. There was going to be, it was still pretty threatening, right? You can go, but you're not coming back. Instead of which, what happened on that night was it all just came down. It was freedom to come and go as you please. And so there is a counterfactual here. If this was an accident, a bureaucratic mistake, a moment of panic, it might easily not have happened. He could have been better briefed. I don't think there's a scenario in which once people had massed in their tens of thousands, the border guards were going to start shooting them. But there is a scenario in which that press conference was better handled and people were not encouraged to mass in their tens of thousands. He said, no, it doesn't apply to the Berlin Wall as a special designated point, or it doesn't start tonight, or we're still in charge of this process. And in a sense, the towel was thrown in by someone who just didn't know what to do. So there's an immediate counterfactual here, but it's very different from the one that we started this short series of episodes recently, talking to Chris Clark about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. That's also something that could easily not have happened, right? The bullet might have missed. Princip might have lost his nerve. The car could have taken a different turn. It's absolute sort of accident of history. Had it not happened, there wouldn't have been a First World War. Something else would have followed, but history would have been very different. But this one feels like, okay, if they hadn't thrown in the towel that night, the pressure would have built. Even that announcement, a well-handled press conference, people would have shown up the next day. The pressure was building and building and building. Do you have any sense in which there was a way that this outcome could have been forestalled for much longer than a few days or maybe a few weeks? Is it the kind of accident where in the end something was going to give? Surely yes.
I think my answer would probably be no, in the sense that it seems to me that this is the culmination of a series of events that were all heading in this direction of, increasingly open travel for East German citizens to West Germany. And there had been significant changes of leadership in the East German government. Only a few weeks before, the historic leader Erich Honecker had been replaced by someone much younger, more reformist character called Egon Krenz. And the old kind of Stasi guys were somehow also on the way out, and Milke and so on. So I think in that sense, it seemed like this government was on the way to reforming itself. And the law, which, yes, there is a question of how is it going to be implemented and when does the law come into being and what the timing of it is exactly. But in a sense, the regulations had changed and the laws had changed. And there was a genuine shift, I think, in terms of the East German officials and their thinking about how to open. So perhaps what matters there is the perception around the loss of control. And so the relevant counterfactual is not so much would the Berlin Wall have come down or not, but had it come down in this less chaotic way and where the East German officials are shown to be much more in control of the process, that might have changed the perception from the outside of this government and therefore also then the standing and the way in which the successive reforms were conducted. But in terms of the event itself, I think it was the culmination of a long period of economic crisis. East Germany was stagnating. I personally always thought that the moment they started selling political prisoners to get money so they could buy bananas to show their citizens that they were open and they were willing to give them consumer goods like proper jeans and these other things that they didn't have, like bananas and tropical fruit and so on, that's to me the sign of a kind of collapse. Once you're forced to do that, there's something going on fundamentally that will eventually change. But I think, there are changes that might have been different had the transition been managed differently and had the East German government looked like they were more in control of the process.
And as you say, it was a relatively new government. Egon Krenz was younger, but these were still party apparatchiks. I mean, these people were still, their hands were dirty, right? As my historian friend said, these people were, this was not a clean set of hands, right? They were deeply invested in this regime. And I think also the other thing over which they lost control is that they thought right up until the end, they were engaged in a process of negotiation with the West. So there were two crises happening simultaneously. One, people wanted to leave. And the other is these countries were bankrupt. They couldn't repay their debts to the West, and they needed to refinance their loans to the West. This has been a long-standing story, but it reached a moment of crisis. And so they needed something to bargain with in order to refinance these loans. And I think the understanding had been they would bargain with people, a bit like for bananas, but in this case for refinancing. They would bargain by letting people out, the thing that the West wanted, particularly West Germany, but in a managed way. And as I say, in a way that sort of said to people, you can go and you can't come back. And in return, that would give them some stake or leverage in these negotiations. That all collapsed on the night that the wall came down.
Yeah, but my sense is also that to bargain, you have to know what you're bargaining with. And in a way, there, the actions just of these German government are relevant, but you have to also look at the wider context, by which I mean the Soviet Union, which had been the traditional ally. And it's no coincidence that at some point, while Honecker is still in power, it looks like his thinking and that of Gorbachev, who is in charge of the party in the Soviet Union, are not that aligned. And that, there's this famous sentence by Honecker who says, forward always, backwards never, when he's in a discussion with Gorbachev about the direction of reforms and the need to change these countries and the need to think about socialism differently. Both of these governments were thinking of this moment as, and I noticed this reading about this period, in parallel with Lenin's transition to the new economic policy after the Bolshevik Revolution. There's a moment where Lenin realizes that they need to have markets somehow in their favor and that they need to give space to the local bourgeoisie and they need to open up. And they both have that model, as does Deng Xiaoping in China, actually. They both have the Lenin model in mind for the transition as they enter this process, which, of course, in the Soviet Union had been going on for even longer with the famous, the glasnost and the perestroika. Gorbachev had been involved in trying to reform both the party and open up to markets. But as you say, also under very, very difficult market conditions where there's all this inflation and the problem with loans and the fact that they were facing a West. And that seems to me crucial, actually, a West that was at that point ideologically pretty homogeneous in its hostility to anything like even market socialism, let's say, or even contained democracy that's where you have not the neoliberal purity. So I think what was as important as how these actors were thinking about internal reform was what their Western adversaries looked like and how they thought about the relationship between states and markets. And had the Western leaders at the time, like Thatcher and Reagan, been less Puritan about the relationship between the market and the state under those general conditions of globalization and given the constraints that the Soviet Union and East Germany were facing, it seems to me the direction of these negotiations might have been very, very different. Because it seems to me here you have communist countries in crisis facing capitalist countries, all very convinced that the right path is neoliberalism, basically.
And yet there's an irony here, which is certainly Thatcher, but also Mitterrand in France, were horrified when the wall came down. Not because they wanted to preserve an alternative to Western capitalism in Eastern Europe, but because they had a deep-seated traditional anxiety about German domination of the European continent. And the idea of a unified, united Germany, for them, was a throwback to something that they thought Europe was better off without. Which meant, in a way, the East German regime did have a serious negotiating chip that it threw away. The Americans maybe less so, but certainly Western Europeans would have been quite happy to preserve a divided Germany in some form or another. The question is what form that would take. What would the regime in the East have looked like, given the financial pressures it was under, given the popular resistance to the existing regime? But the idea that you allow the wall simply to come down, which I think people recognized almost immediately was a path on the road to reunification. Once that had been swept away, it's going to be very hard to preserve two states in one country. But there was an appetite in the West, actually, to keep two versions of Germany going simply to prevent it from being this monolith at the heart of the continent.
Yeah, and there I would say maybe is where agency does make a difference, because in the first free elections in East Germany, a few months after the fall of the Berlin Walls, I think it was March 1990 or something, the opposition parties, they don't get a majority, they just fall short of an absolute majority, but they present themselves on a program of never again socialism. At which point, the path towards reunification begins to look conceivable in terms of how you think about the future of East Germany. Because what does an East Germany that is not socialist look like? Well, it looks like West Germany, at which point it loses its rationale. Since the only distinctive identity that East Germany had was a political identity, once that political identity is gone and the pressure from these opposition movements that had been quite active also in the months leading up to the collapse of the wall, whether it was the Lutheran church-based movements or whether it was the anti-militarism, anti-nuclear movement, some of them were similar to the ones that were also around in the West at that time. But there was a significant grassroots movement, especially based in, as I say, the Protestant churches in East Germany. And I've met several of these people many years after who talked about what was it like to be in those movements underground and what sense they had that things were going to change. But once there was the first truly free election in March 1990, well, the first and only, because after that the GDR collapsed, that election was important in shaping the discussion around reunification. And while, as I say, there wasn't an absolute majority, and certainly the terms of the reunification were themselves then shaped by subsequent politics in West Germany as much as in East Germany, that's where the mood begins to change and people start thinking, well, maybe even though it looks to the outside world that this great Germany is maybe not a good idea because it poses a threat geopolitically to the continent, from the point of view of German citizens and East German citizens, it was conceivable in a way. And that's, this was their country and they had a shared history, even though it started dividing at some point.
And how much do you think of what happened in the spring of 1990 is a consequence of what happened on that night in November 1989? Because the collapse of the regime, the effective concession that they had lost all control, did hand power over to both the West and also to the people of East Germany. I think there is a scenario in which more control was retained, and it would have remained a kind of three-way process in a sense, that three things would have been going on simultaneously. There would have been the popular mood, the resistant movements, and how they would have morphed into something more mainstream or capable of fighting elections, whatever it was. There would have been the pressure from the West, both to become more capitalist, but also not to become a big, powerful, monstrous Germany again. But the regime itself would have also been right at the heart of that, presumably trying to shape both. And it was almost as though you take the regime out and you just get a sort of meeting of the Western perspective and the popular perspective. And I'm not making a judgment about this. I'm just thinking about the sort of historical eventuality because, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I mean, regimes did go different ways at the end of this. It's not like what happened in East Germany or indeed in Eastern Europe is the only way to go. You've talked about Albania. There was China. There was Tiananmen Square in the summer of 1989. I mean, even the fall of the wall, it's sort of bookended by two violent events. Tiananmen Square, and also, as you've mentioned, the killing of Ceausescu. And in between it, there is this period in November, including the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It's the outlier in some ways.
Yeah, you're right. It's the outlier, but symbolically, it's really, really powerful because this is where people in the region begin to realize that actually these governments, they haven't got it all together. They are not in control. And in fact, this was both, I think, the problem. In a way, it's the great victory of the people at some level because you realize that there's agency and it's not all controlled from the top. And there are these months that lead up to the Berlin Wall where people have been feeling their way. And the famous picnic, for example, in the summer of 1989 at the border between Austria and Hungary was in part conceived as a test of both Gorbachev and other communist authorities around Europe to see what the Soviet Union would do if there was this crossing from Hungary to Austria. Would they go back to send the tanks as they had done before in their history, or would they just ignore it? And the fact that Gorbachev doesn't react is taken as a sign that you can push the boundary further and further. So it seems to me that throughout this period, there is this constant, there is, yes, a process managed from the top, and also movements from below that test the boundaries of the leadership and continue to press and press. And in some ways, I think the Berlin Wall falling, the night itself, is the culmination of that. And then it enables the later story to be told as a story of people being in charge. And, the images of being on the wall are symbolically very, very powerful because you can no longer tell the story as a story of management of elites that talk to each other and negotiate and decide what needs to be done. And it's the people themselves that actually climb on the wall and actually take control. And I think that whole symbolism had a really profound impact in the region in both good and bad ways, because it was, on the one hand, the culmination of this process of end of dictatorship and end of being abused by these parties that were dinosaurs and were really not in touch with the masses. But then it also created this illusion of a lasting democracy that, you will always have a voice and you can always take control and that you have real agency, when in fact, it seems to me that what followed and the transition shows that is there's very little of that left. So I always thought of these months around 1989, 1990 in Albania, a little bit later, early months of 1991. This was the only time where you felt really democracy matters, and these movements, they can do things and they can change the direction of history one way or another, where in fact later you realize that this is much harder and maybe it turns out to be an illusion as much as anything else.
And apart from anything else, it was very quick. It all happened very fast. from the fall of the wall to the reunification of Germany. That happened very quickly to elections, but also then quickly to a sense that the ideological contests had been settled, that there wasn't a great debate to be had, a great maybe slower debate to be had about the range of possibilities for a country that East Germany that had ceased to exist, but there wasn't only one way that country could go, right? Even folded into West Germany, there wasn't only one way it could go, but it was quite quickly settled, that question. Do you think there's a slower version?
Yes, and in part, that is where the counterfactual around the Night of the Wall becomes relevant. Because it seems to me that while there was a will, even if you assume that there was a will of East Germany to merge with West Germany, the terms of the merger weren't really clear from the start. And it's also not clear that there was a majority view that East Germany would just be absorbed under the West German constitution. And what happens is effectively, and some East German historians have written about this, it's almost like the end of a war where you have a loser and a winner, and the terms of peace are dictated by the winner. And somehow the winner is West Germany. And the process of then absorption of East Germany into West Germany is one with the very high cost for a lot of East German citizens. And we still see today the repercussions of that process in a way. And also the resentment that that led to, because even though this was a Cold War, it really was like a war in the way in which it ended, where you had a very clear sense of these are the winners and they tell you what the rules are, and the losers, their country is gone, their constitution is gone, their leadership is gone, and all there is for them is to just absorb the new peace settlement somehow. When in fact, if things had been different and you hadn't had this completely symbolically charged night and interpretation of what the night meant, an interpretation of the will of these people who were standing there on top of the wall and trying to, all wanting to be like West Germany, you might have had a different conversation around, okay, what can the unified Germany take from East Germany that is good, and what needs to change in West Germany compared to what was being done in East Germany. Gender questions, for example, is one of the cases that is often mentioned as legislation that was much more progressive in East Germany than in West Germany, but that was completely ignored in this very rushed process of absorbing East German institutions into West Germany. Parts of the educational system in the month of reunification, and then afterwards, the result was that teachers had to be retrained, for example, or East German universities were filled with West German academics who would come to teach real philosophy as opposed to this dogmatic Marxist-Leninism that they've been learning for years. And that all takes a long time to be understood and absorbed, and I think leaves its marks on the national conscience. And I think we still see the results of that process now in contemporary German politics, actually.
As you say, just in the last couple of weeks, there have been regional elections in Eastern German regions where the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, have done well. And the parties of the centre, particularly the parties of the governing coalition and the SPD above all, have done catastrophically badly. And the coverage, some of it has said, there were two countries, they became one country, but actually they really still are two countries. And you can see the divide is far greater, and that rush process papered over a whole set of cracks that still exist. There's a deep history of divided experience that doesn't get erased by a coming together around a democratic program in the early 1990s. It looked like it was a consensus.
Absolutely. But what I find problematic about the way that's interpreted now is that when you read the coverage around, for example, the triumph of AfD in East Germany, a lot of the interpretation is, well, the East Germans, they never liked democracy anyway. And it's almost as though there is this kind of inherent attraction to non-democratic authoritarian movements. And what people forget, there was what triggered these changes, what began this process. The people had a genuine will to be democratic. They liked democracy. They wanted to change. They were ready to leave their country behind to have democracy. And it seems to me that the interpretations that say, well, the East Germans, they never had a democratic culture, and that's why they're attracted to these movements, actually do a disservice to this moment of opening where there was a genuine will to have democratic change. And it's only because democratic change was understood as leading to a certain path to reform, a certain way of understanding the relationship between states and markets, neoliberalism in its kind of more crude shock therapy. That is what has produced a disaffection for democracy. And that's the result rather than the origin of this story. And it seems to me that the coverage somehow gets this wrong.
Say the wall hadn't fallen in that chaotic way and the pace of change had been slowed. Say that the regime, without defending itself by violence, which I don't think was a possibility at this point, certainly it would have taken the Soviets to do it. The East Germans weren't going to do it themselves. And Gorbachev, as you said, had signaled already earlier that summer, the Tiananmen Square model was not going to be his path. And indeed, the Chinese did the Tiananmen Square path for themselves, partly so as not to be Gorbachev. So all of this was going on simultaneously. But there is a version of history where you get a violent repression of this movement, not where the regime somehow props itself up indefinitely, but where it's slowed down, and the unraveling of East Germany is a more drawn out process. What kind of version, maybe not even of a united Germany, but in other parts of Eastern Europe or in East Germany itself, what kind of version of that regime do you think was possible that was the reformed version, the sustainable version, the more durable version, but wasn't the co-opted neoliberal shock therapy version? It feels like there must be space between propping up a dead, moribund, corrupt regime and the crash course in neoliberal capitalism that Eastern Europe was given. It feels like there's a big space between those two things. And yet it's quite hard historically to conjure up the circumstances in which you do get something which is between those two things. So give me something that might have existed between those two things.
Well, I mean, I think it's really hard to think of what might have existed, in part because the conversation in East Germany is not separate from what was going on in the Soviet Union. And in fact, I think it's completely dependent on what was going on in the Soviet Union and how Gorbachev was leading, and the extent to which Gorbachev is himself personally responsible, or whether he succumbed to different pressures. He was under pressure from both the hardline communists and the Yeltsin crowd to manage the change. And I think it's really hard to think of what would have looked like institutionally. But the one question that I often wonder about is, whatever form these institutions would have, would we actually have had the same borders in Europe? Because the impact, for example, of a reunified Germany on, say, the borders of former Yugoslavia, on the recognition of these breakaway republics from Yugoslavia. Unified Germany was the first country to recognize independent Slovenia, in some ways disrupting a process where European community states were in negotiation with both Yugoslav authorities and with separatists in all of these former Yugoslav republics that were all unsettled at that point. And it seems to me that the reunification of Germany had a huge impact in what borders emerged then in Europe. And indeed, the Soviet Union parallel processes, challenges to Gorbachev's leadership also led to a different redrawing of borders in the Soviet Union. And all of these things are questions. The borders are still borders that we now discuss. And a lot of the conflicts, including Ukraine now, are the results of some of these tensions. Geopolitically, it might have looked very different just because the political units within this unit that we might call larger European continent would have been very, very different. A second aspect, I guess, that we might think of counterfactually is what would have happened if the pleas from Russian authorities to join both NATO and the EU had been heeded at the time. There was this moment in 1991 where Yeltsin was begging to be considered part of NATO and indeed later also integrated into the European community structures. And that seemed to be like a path that wasn't taken and might have led into a very, very different direction if these institutions had been absorbed into these transnational organizations. I think the bit where I'm most skeptic is what would have happened internally, because one of the original problems of the Gorbachev model was that he was leading with both economic reform and political reform and trying to do the same at the same time. And that was what Deng objected and thought as a criticism to the Gorbachev model, was exactly that he was saying, why are you doing the political reform? First do the economic reform, neoliberalism, or liberalized and open up to markets and foreign investment. And then if it looks like it's working, then you can open politically bit by bit. Whereas the Russians, the Soviets were growing with both. And indeed, all of these countries went with both. And what ended up happening is that they undermined the controlling power of the communist parties in office. So the parties were just gone and the state was in charge of them, of the reforms. And then eventually the reforms were more and more shaped by Western actors and responding to pressures by Western actors. And so then shock therapy came and the reforms took a very harsh form. And China there is actually the real existing counterfactual, because it did something very different, which was not let go control of the party, but open the markets. And I think maybe that's what Europe would have looked like if the Soviet Union had not started the glasnost and perestroika process in the way in which Gorbachev started it. And then East Germany would have followed because it was a satellite state anyway.
There's another real existing counterfactual that you mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago. So you've just come back from Vietnam. You were there for a working holiday, if I had to say. And I asked you how it was. And you said in an email, it might have been a throwaway line, it might not. You said, oh, it's great. It's a glimpse of what Albania might have been, you said, Vietnam. So there's another country, which, there are many, many versions of the end of this story. And Vietnam is a country we've talked about in this series. We did a episode about the possibilities in 1964 of the Vietnam War not having got going in the way that it did, and a different kind of unification of Vietnam, something more national and less ideological. But the Vietnam story is also interesting here. So what did you mean when you said Vietnam is an example of what Albania could have been?
Well, in part, I went to Vietnam because I was really curious to see what does this socialist country, or a country that calls itself socialist but is completely open to markets and has open to foreign investment and privatization in the way in which former communist countries did in Europe as well after 1990. I just wanted to see what it looked like and to sort of experience on the ground. And also because I was always intrigued by this paradox of this country that is constitutionally socialist and with a socialist ethos, and then really open to markets. And it is a paradox. And I hadn't realized before I traveled how much of a paradox it is. I thought it was more attractive before I went. And when I went, I realized that this is actually a country that reminds me a little bit of like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, where there is an official doctrine and you can challenge everything, but not the official doctrine. And weirdly, I found in Vietnam, there was much more difficulty presenting papers and giving lectures, and that much more control when you said that you wanted to give a paper in Marx than if I had said I want to talk about Kissinger or Fukuyama. So there was much more a sense of wanting to control the narrative on socialism and Marxist topics, and anything else was completely fine and tolerated, except for these bits of research that were touching the core of the state orthodoxy. So it was really, for me, I just kind of meant it literally. I wanted to see what Albania would have looked like, because I think that's what would have happened if the party had not given up control in these former communist countries. You would have a model like China or like Vietnam, where you have an elite that calls itself socialist, but actually overseeing a process of opening up to the markets that's in many ways quite similar to what was going on in post-communist Europe, and indeed what Albania went through. And I noticed just empirically, a lot of things were really similar. You have these big towers and buildings over everywhere, and there's a kind of building bubble. You have an economy that is clearly very, very open to all sorts of private influence and very market-based. And even what I found really interesting and surprising, an openness to American culture that I wouldn't have thought was possible in a country that had been at war with the United States until very, very recently. And you have this living memory of this very traumatic war. But that is the extent to which there is globalized culture that's also captured. So culturally, it didn't look like it was that different from what I now see when I travel around former communist Europe. In terms of, as I say, processes on the ground, it felt very similar. Where the difference is on the degree of political control over these processes. And from the point of view of foreign capital investors, I guess it's a good thing that you have a party that is in charge and is controlling. And so you don't have this kind of democracy that can go wild in all kinds of directions that you can't control. But that, to me, was not the virtue in a way. I thought, looking about this transition counterfactually, I thought there might be, if you have a country that calls itself socialist, they might be willing to protect certain social standards or socialist standards. And I just didn't have the impression that that was the case very much. In fact, the socialism was there just to police opposition, and indeed mostly opposition from the left.
So does that suggest that if you play the counterfactual over a period of decades rather than months or years, you think in the end it does come out in the wash? So that there's a version of Eastern Europe, say, where the regimes hold on, they do something, let's call it more Chinese, so that they were much weaker. The Eastern European regimes were much weaker. It would have required the Soviet Union to agree that that was the strategy. But they do remain in place, and therefore some of that sort of shock version of capitalism or neoliberalism doesn't hit with quite the same force. So the 1990s would have been different for sure. And a lot of it was shocking, the speed of it and the rapidity with which people's lives changed, some for better, many for worse. Many became much more precarious. That would have slowed down. But if you run the story forward a few decades until now, it suggests from what you've just said that you don't think in the end there are these different paths that history might have taken. It feels more convergent, or something else would have had to be different. Something else, presumably in the West or in other countries, would have had to be different for the story to have taken a different path.
Yeah, and maybe the differences are about things that we can't quite tell now. So I think that there are some differences that are there and they're real. I do think nationalism and the way in which nationalism has broken in Europe and shaped the geopolitics of Europe is things might have been different than all these breakout groups and the possibility of exploiting nationalist sentiments from all kinds of political purposes. The balance of all those elements might look different if the different transition path had been chosen. From the point of view of someone who was very sympathetic to these dissident movements in 1989 and thinks of them still as a model of, citizens trying to exercise democratic agency, they both are stories of disappointment, because I think what was great about Havel and these dissidents in 1989 was that it wasn't clear that what they wanted was neoliberalism. They wanted to democratize socialist countries, and I think democratizing socialist countries would have been a great idea, because for me, the biggest problem was the stagnation of democracy in these countries. And the economic issues are in some ways connected, but there are ways, I think we may have talked about this before, there are ways in which you can normalize a crisis if you have the feeling of democracy and agency. And when you don't have that feeling, then it's really, you lose control somehow. So for me, the loss of the spirit of 1989 and of these dissident movements is the loss of the possibility of the world just being different, both in the East and in the West, whereby in the West, the result was that everyone believed, okay, this is now the winning model, and so we just need to export it around the world. And we are still there because that is the winning model. And unfortunately, it's the winning model also if you look at China and Vietnam, because these are societies that are very, very driven by consumerist values, despite their rhetoric of socialism and despite the fact that whenever they present their party papers, they have quotes from Marx and Lenin. It's just on the surface. When you look at what actual policies they implement, what kind of taxation they put on multinationals, for example, or how they decide about the distribution of wealth, it's not that different from any other country that is trying to open up to the markets and attract foreign direct investments. So it seems to me that it was a loss for the West because we lost the sense that the world might be different and you might not think about free markets in the same way. But it was also a loss for the East because the spirit of the dissident of 1989 just collapsed and was interpreted as a desire to convert to capitalist values. And yeah, I think you're right. The end of that story is that capitalism, one way or another, has won in both of these. However you run the counterfactual, it seems to me that the stable element there is that capitalism more or less has prevailed. And where there is resistance to capitalism, it's declined in terms of national sentiment or a resistance that comes from particular identities rather than from attachment to another way of thinking about markets and labor.
But you could also say nationalism has prevailed as well, because in the Chinese case, in the Vietnam case, nationalism is a key part of what these regimes stand for. In the episode in this series about Vietnam with Thant Minh Tu, where we talked about the possibilities for peace, potentially at least, that were foreclosed in 1964, and he was talking about it from the perspective of the United Nations and its attempts to broker a peace, and the view at the top of the UN, which was the Americans had fundamentally misunderstood the Viet Cong. They saw the Viet Cong as a deeply ideological communist movement. They weren't. They were a nationalist movement. And actually, nationalism in Vietnam was going to come out on top. And there was a way of doing it without the war, which would have produced something that the Americans might have been comfortable with as not the triumph of communist ideology, but another version of a nationalist story. And that does seem also to feed all the way through this. The Chinese approach from 1989 onwards has been not just to marry economic liberalization with the absence of political liberalization, but also to marry economic liberalization with a strong nationalist sentiment. The alternatives to nationalism also aren't that widely available.
I mean, what's really interesting is also the fact that there is, in the end, one version of nationalism, which is a nation-state version of nationalism. Because what you have in the context of just thinking counterfactually about the collapse of communism in East Europe is that you have these other nationalisms that weren't really on the agenda, that then begin to emerge as the project unravels. And something like that is still the case in China and Vietnam. These are countries with huge minorities inside them, each of which could become a breakaway group or a breakaway republic. And that's where the authoritarian nature of these institutions is actually a stabilizer. It contains these nationalisms, and it means that the state is keeping a lid on them and managing them somehow. And that's maybe more of the difference with Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Yugoslavia. But I think ultimately you're right that the problem of socialism is the problem of how you reconcile nationalism and socialism at the end. And the fact that historically these socialist states have all been at war with each other or in competition with each other. You have these different versions. It has a lot to do with the way in which they are combined and reconciled with nationalism.
Next time, we're going to be talking about another counterfactual possibility, which is what if Scotland had voted yes to independence in 2014, which would have changed the story about what counts as a nation and a nation state. But that's for next time. I just want to finish this with your sense of what is the range of historical possibility as we look back on this now. So as you said, you have a lot of sympathy with the movements at the time. This is with hindsight. As a child, you weren't aware of them. And then you've written about this in Free, the experience of living through that period in Albania. But when you look back on it now, and that sense that there was something there that has now been lost, and whatever opened up at the end of the 1980s closed down again relatively quickly. It got squeezed between these two possibilities, the Chinese Vietnam model and the Western co-option model. And whatever existed between those two things got squeezed pretty quickly. Over the period where you've been adult, conscious, thinking about these things, have there been points where you felt a sense that history is opening up again in that way? Are there periods that you can think of, or even is now such a period, where you feel that there is something illusory about the foreclosing of possibility and the speed with which it happened, that maybe that was the illusion?
I would say, well, we may be in one such moment now. It's just that the difference between now and 1989 was that, as I saw it, and already then, you're right, I was a child, but I was very much involved. My mother was in the dissident movement. You know, there was freedom in the air. Democracy was the name that was being mentioned everywhere. So even if you were a 10, 11-year-old, you could not afford not to be moved at all by what goes on and find this very interesting and inspiring. But I think the difference is that in 1989, these were movements that were actively advocating for democracy. Whereas the juncture at which we're now, it's the opposite. You have a resistance towards democracy and indeed a disillusionment and a critique of democracy that ends up encouraging authoritarian movements. And so while, yes, you know, the balance is always there, open, and things could go in very, very different ways, and there could be a radical change, I'm actually much more pessimistic about what is going on now. And in fact, I'm much more worried about war, possibly even war on a global scale. Whereas in 1989, you didn't have a prospect of war on a global scale that you're staring at. It was more this sense of hope and this idea that these societies might democratize, and the open question of what would be the direction of these democratic movements. Whereas now I feel like there's a general disenchantment with politics and with democracy, for which the only thing that one can say when we're talking about counterfactuals and how history makes a difference is to say, well, remember, there is always agency, and remember, things can always be different. But ultimately, there's not really much of a replication of experience in terms of direction of change.
And as you talk about that, I find myself thinking about that period. I remember the 1980s, most of it, I was a child or a young student, was lived in the shadow of the possibility of war. You know, certainly the early 1980s were a terrifying time to be a child. And 1982, 83 in particular, like the world felt like it was on the edge of something catastrophic. And no question that faded over the 80s. So by the end of the 1980s, that feeling of being on the edge of the precipice had gone.
Yeah, and there were all these disarmament agreements and demilitarization discussions around peace, human rights. You know, Helsinki was really important in Albania at the time. So there was a sense that institutions are moving in a direction of peace rather than war.
And yet the thing that I don't think was there, so I can only speak for myself and I might have completely missed it, but from what you described, you would think that in the West, there would also be some feeling seeing this genuine democratic movement, peaceful people power. It was monumental in its way. It was a mass movement and it was inspiring. People were deeply inspired by Havel. by the Lutheran protests in East Germany, by the courage of the people who went to that picnic. You go to a picnic to test if they're going to send in the tanks. That's a pretty brave, that's not your average picnic, right? It's no picnic, to use a phrase. And yet, I don't remember there being a thought, well, we could learn something from that we have these things that we call democracies, but they are already a bit tired, a bit set in their ways. Our elections are heavily managed processes. There's a lot of professional communication. Nothing terrible was happening, but the frustration with that kind of democracy was still there, or it was already there. And here's something which is a more palpable, genuine version of a thing that almost everyone recognized was inspiring. The thing I don't remember was anyone thinking, and therefore we in the West could learn from that. I just don't remember that being there at all.
That goes back to something that we said at the beginning for me, which is the complete hegemonic consent around neoliberalism in Western countries at the time. So while the socialist world was in crisis, and in a way there was more agency because of the crisis and because people were trying to think, okay, what's the political identity of these institutions going to be if people were to matter more? It seems to me that in the West, the consensus was, well, all you need to do is just dismantle the state, privatize, open up to the markets. And the question of how you can have more democracy was irrelevant because democracy was always assumed to be there. It's how you interpret democracy in a bourgeois liberal society, free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of association. And that was it. And that's what was assumed these countries wanted, Eastern European countries wanted, and the West already had. So there was no sense that the West might learn something from the East, or indeed want to have any of the things like social protection or maybe conversations around gender that the East had. There was no conversation really between these two blocks. It was just one part that got it all right. And at a moment where there was real hegemony, I think about that fact that neoliberalism was the right thing to do and the right path to take, and where the Thatcher and Reagan were really successful in their message. Even if they weren't successful eventually electorally, they were quite successful, I think, in shaping the consent and shaping the conversation and shaping the discourse. And on the other hand, you had these countries that just had to become like them, so had to mimic them.
And this is hindsight again, but you could say that when you think about the counterfactuals, the possibility that another version of capitalism was going to be on display in Eastern Europe looks a little bit wishful. But the other thing of which there are many different varieties is democracy. Democracy is a much, much more multifaceted concept than conventional electoral Western liberal democracy. And here was an example of something which was definitely democratic and wasn't much like until it was squeezed into the electoral version of it. But in that form, in that late 1989 form, it wasn't much like Western liberal party managed democracy. There is a real possibility there of an alternative way of doing democracy. And that got squeezed out straight away. You said at the beginning, you go very quickly from the fall of the wall to the spring elections. And from that point, the path is set. So it's really only a few months where there was also a variety of democracies on display. And that's something that we have really lost.
Yeah, and this idea of social movements that try to shape what the state looks like. I think the model from then on has been one of complete separation between the social movements and the party system and the institutions. Whereas I think in 1989, what was distinctive about these dissident movements was exactly the fact that they were trying to appropriate democracy, but without thinking of dissident movements as completely outside the state. So they were really trying to shape the direction of the state. And already at that level, they were an alternative model of how to think about democracy and how to think about representation, which I agree with you, was lost very quickly after and has been lost in the West since.
We have got one more episode to come in this counterfactual series, and it's the one that I mentioned in today's episode. I'm going to be talking to the historian Ben Jackson about something that happened almost exactly 10 years ago when Scotland voted no to independence. What would have happened if Scotland had voted yes? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.